Well, thanks very much for your attendance. This morning I read an article in the Fairfax Press, which is now part of a pattern, an established pattern. A pattern of anonymous briefings of selected journalists by somebody, who knows who, allegedly from a national security agency. And the pattern is, at each turn, with each new article, the loyalty of Chinese background Australians to our nation is impugned. And there's a pattern here. Today it's aimed at Ernest Wong. In the past it's been aimed at elected councillors in local government, Chinese background Australians who've chosen to become involved in our politics, been elected to local councils. We've seen that peddler of prejudices, Clive Hamilton, attack the loyalty of a young man from my neck of the woods who represents Auburn on the Cumberland Council, Kun Huang. And I say it's time to stop. I'm not prepared to sit by while the loyalties of Chinese background Australians to our nation is regularly questioned. I mean, what happens here, there's a taint with each of these articles. People are tainted as at best unwitting dupes of a foreign power and at worst disloyal to Australia. And so I'll write to ASIO today and I'll invite the Director General of ASIO to brief me that if he has any concerns about any member of my team, any New South Wales Labor MP, to brief me on his concerns. But I do say that these anonymous briefings by who knows who of selected journalists to cast a taint over Chinese migrants and Australian citizens who've become involved in our democratic process, that should stop. It's extremely irregular, it's highly improper, and it is a new McCarthyism, and it does reveal a Cold War mentality. I won't have 500,000 Chinese background Australians in Australia's largest city subjected to this, where their loyalty to our nation is questioned regularly. It's highly irregular, highly improper, and it should stop. Happy to answer your questions.
Well, how do you know there's not genuine concerns there? And how do you know even that on your trip with Ernest Wong that there weren't situations where intelligence officials weren't targeting you in China?
Well, if there's concerns, ASIO can brief me on those concerns. They never have, they've never come near me. But I'll write to them today and say, if you have concerns, come and see me and brief me. But you know, the proper way to go about things is not through anonymous briefings of selected journalists that just cast a taint, that just taint people, that are based on smear and innuendo. I mean, in today's paper, there's no names, you know, just the suggestions put out there that an MP's been cultivated by agents of a foreign power. I mean, let's keep some perspective here. I hope and trust Joe Hockey's over in Washington cultivating members of the US Congress to form a favourable opinion of Australia. And if he's not doing his job. There's a thing called diplomacy. I mean, I'm regularly approached by Chinese diplomats, American diplomats, Turkish diplomats, Korean diplomats, Japanese diplomats, the diplomats of so many countries. I mean, that's what's called diplomacy. Governments send diplomats abroad to cultivate and promote a favourable impression of their nation on foreign shores. It's called diplomacy. Now, if there's something sinister here, and if there's something improper involving any of my MPs, I'd expect to know about it. I'll invite ASIO to brief me on that.
But isn't the substance of the article this morning that he was targeted, but they say that he didn't actually do anything improper? So what is wrong with raising awareness that MPs, regardless of their background, are being targeted?
But this isn't the way to do it, David. Through, you know, I mean, who knows whether this is sanctioned by the chiefs of ASIO or it's some rogue, you know, gumshoe with a shoe to his ear. doing something improper. I mean, who would know? But this isn't the way to conduct serious national security business. And you have a China panic here, a new McCarthyism. And there's an agenda here. Ms. Berejiklian sends out one of her senior ministers to attack my colleagues and I as traitors on the floor of the parliament. A bloke who's accepted travel from the Taiwanese government, paid for by the Taiwanese, who's a regular on the Taiwanese independence circuit, whose public stance is at odds with the settled policy of Australia and America and virtually every other country on earth that recognises one China. But Robert stands there at the behest of Berejiklian and attacks me and Labor colleagues as a traitor. And he says, the people of New South Wales can no longer be sure which are the opposition's policies and which are China's policies. I mean, this is a bloke whose loyalties are to Taiwanese independence, who's at odds with settled Australian foreign policy. And it's time to call this out.
So you want journalists to reveal their sources just so you can feel better about the story?
No, I would never.
Well, why do they have to say who they heard it from in ASIO if it even was ASIO?
Well, you don't. I mean, I'm not
That's
asking.
what you're saying the story should be based and be more clear, but that's not up to them. Like, it's obviously a true story. They published it. Why do they have to make you feel better about whoever's in your party or what you're doing in China?
I'm not asking any journalist to reveal their source. I'm saying that there's a proper way for the security agencies to conduct their affairs. This is not it. This is extremely irregular. This is improper. And it is contrary to the national interest for an entire community's loyalty to our country to be questioned. And that is what's going on here. Let's be honest, there's a long pattern.
Who has said that? Where is the entire community targeted? Sam Bestier, was he part of that community? No.
Well, there's a pattern here now of many articles and reports over a year. There's this Clive Hamilton peddling his prejudices that suggest that anyone from the Chinese migrant community involved in our democratic process is at best an unwitting dupe of communist China, or worse. And I won't stand by while the loyalties of 500,000 Chinese background Australians in our capital city are questioned like this.
Where are the loyalties? Forget the 500,000 Chinese, but even Ernest Wong, his loyalty's not questioned there.
No, I mean, Alex, I know Ernest, his loyalties to New South Wales and Australia, but there's a taint here, and I don't blame the journalists for writing it when they get somebody from ASIO, authorised or rogue, providing them with these kind of breathless revelations. I don't blame the journalists for printing those stories, but it does serve to taint Mr. Wong in this case. In other cases, the small number of Chinese background Australians who've been elected to Sydney councils. Now, there was an article in The Australian several months ago on a Saturday morning that talked about how, once again on the basis of anonymous briefings and backgroundings by national security sources of journalists, that questioned or suggested that councillors had been penetrated by foreign agents, by Chinese agents. And, it's not a long list. It's not a long list of Chinese background Australians who serve on our local councils. So each of them suddenly is under a taint and a cloud of suspicion.
I'll see what you're saying, Mr. Foley, but if the Director General of ASIO meets you and identifies real concerns to you, aren't you going to look like a bit of a goose then for having this press conference?
No, Andrew, because I'm inviting them to do that, and if they have real concerns, my door's open. My door's open, and I think that's the proper way to proceed, rather than through anonymous briefings. And look, I'd give the ASIO chief the benefit of the doubt here. I mean, this may well be somebody within the agency who's gone rogue, who's talking off the record without authorisation. That might be the case. I'll write to the ASIO chief and invite him to brief me on any concerns his agency may have about any of my MPs.
Have you spoken to Bob Carr or Kayla Manane before making this announcement? Have either of those people encouraged you to make to do this press conference?
I haven't spoken to Kayla on this matter. I've spoken to Bob on launching his book on Saturday. We had a long conversation.
Did he
about...
encourage you to do this press conference?
No. But I told him I'm going to do it, and I'm launching his book on Saturday, and I can report to you that Bob's very focused on how his book's received.
But did him talking to you inspire you to do this press conference?
No. What motivated me to do this press conference, Andrew, was my reading of this article and my reflection that this is not an isolated piece. There's now a pattern of reports in Fairfax, in news, on TV, that individually and, more importantly, cumulatively serve to question the loyalty of Chinese migrants who participate in our democratic process. And I make this point, that if you're an Australian citizen, wherever you come from in the world, you're entitled to participate in our democracy. And your loyalty to Australia should not be questioned, unless there's some very real and direct evidence.
So this thing this report this morning, for you, it's almost the straw that broke the camel's back, is it?
Well, I think enough's enough, Andrew. You know, there's been a number of reports in both electronic and print form. It's been going on for a year, and...
What's it about this particular report that's concerned you?
Well, he's a member of my team. He's a member of my team, and he's alleged to have been cultivated by Chinese agents, but we're not told who has these concerns. We're not told where, by whom.
But he's about to be dumped, isn't he? And isn't that because of these concerns?
No, it's not. I mean, you've written about pre-selections for a very long time, Andrew. You know, other people brought more votes to the table.
What do you think is the better way for ASIO to do? Do you want them to release a very informed report instead of giving out anonymous sources? And what's your advice to them? And how do you distinguish an act of diplomacy and foreign interference? Can you distinguish what you think is the difference?
I'll write to ASIO today and invite them that if they have any concerns about any of my MPs, I'm the New South Wales Labor leader, to brief me on those concerns. I think that's the proper thing for me to do in the circumstances. But there's a broader political debate here. You know, I was under attack in the Parliament 3 Thursdays ago, and I and my colleagues subject to charges of treason and disloyalty and having our policies written for us by Communist China. This debate's spiralling out of control, and it's contrary to the national interest. I just make this point. Our future economic prosperity this century will be based, perhaps above all else, on good and productive relations with China. You know, and
well, let's ask you about Sam Destiari. Okay, so he had to resign over these sorts of issues, over a perception that the foreign influence was playing a role with him, and he was accepting kind of donations from Chinese donors. Do you think that he should have had to resign over that, or perhaps not?
Destiari did the wrong thing, and he paid the price, and he resigned, and that was appropriate. But let's not take one isolated case and smear a whole category of people, particularly Chinese migrants who participate in our Australian democracy. Let's not subject them to smears or innuendo.
But Luke, more generally, do you have no concerns whatsoever with Chinese possible interference in Australia?
Well, I make this point, Catalina. Governments of all persuasions try to cultivate a favourable image of themselves. That's called diplomacy. And I trust that the agencies that work at the Commonwealth level ensure that Australia's interests are served and protected. I also make the point that there are some in our political system. I've given you the example of Mr. Roberts, you know, a regular on the Taiwanese independence circuit, who are seeking to return us to a pre-1972 state of affairs. I mean, they don't accept that we should have good and constructive relations with the People's Republic of China. Now, that's where they'll find an opponent in me, because I think constructive relations between New South Wales, Australia and the People's Republic of China are a good thing for both of our countries, a good thing for New South Wales. I mean, you know, I always say I'm proud of Whitlam establishing diplomatic relations, and I'm proud of Rand being the first Premier of any Australian state to visit China and to sign that groundbreaking sister state relationship with Guangdong. These were big steps forward for our country. They've served our people well. And I don't want us to step back in time 45 years into some Cold War mindset when the likes of Roberts are running around with some infantile fantasy around Taiwanese independence.
Do you think the reports have been racist?
No, I wouldn't make that claim. But, you know, I do worry, Rose, about Chinese background Australians who choose to participate in our democracy being subject to smear and innuendo, or even the hint of a suggestion that they might have dual loyalties or divided loyalties. You know, there's plenty of migrants from all corners of the globe who found their way into public life in Australia, and they all ought to be judged by the same criteria. Because you're a Chinese migrant, I don't think you should be subject to reports. You know, there's something like 5 or 6 Chinese background Australians elected to local councils in Sydney, and that report on a Saturday morning in the national newspaper, you know, cast a taint around all of them, because it didn't name any of them in particular, but it said that, you know, once again, anonymous sources from national security agencies were worried about them.
What if there are concerns? What if you meet with the ASIO chief and he says there are concerns within your party in particular? How are you going to handle that?
Well, Tom, I'd act on them. You know, I'd act on them. I've never received any such representations, but I'm going to be very careful here. I'm going to write to ASIO and invite them to tell me if they have any concerns.
Shouldn't you have written to them first before calling a press conference, kind of blindly defending the entire New South Wales Labor Party and maybe any foreign influence on it?
Well, I think, you know, you read this report this morning. Journalists have been ringing my office asking for my reaction. It's if I didn't turn up, you'd be asking why I hadn't, and I will today both comment publicly and follow through on what I've told you. A letter will be going to ASIO today. My door's open if ASIO want to express concern to me about any of my MPs.
Does anybody like Kayla or Bill Shorten have any concerns, do you know?
Not that they've expressed to me. Not that they've expressed to me. Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot.